Then King Solomon stood before the altar of the Lord in front of the whole assembly of Israel, spread out his hands toward heaven and said, Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth below. You who keep your covenant of love with your servants, who continue wholeheartedly in your way. As the foreigner who does not belong to your people Israel, but has come from a distant land because of your name, for they will hear of your great name and your mighty hand and your outstretched arm. For they will, when they come and pray toward this temple, then hear from heaven your dwelling place. Do whatever the foreigner asks of you, so that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you, as do your own people Israel. And may you know that this house that I have built bears your name.
Our next reading is from Luke. When Jesus had finished his sayings to the people who were listening, he entered Capernaum. There, a centurion's servant, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his servant. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, and he does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at the centurion and turned to the crowd following him and said, "I tell you, I have not found such great faith even in Israel." Then the men who had been sent returned to the house and found the servant well.
I want to thank Reverend Colleen and all of you for giving me this opportunity to preach. And let's go back and look at the prayer that Solomon was praying in that first reading. Solomon had just finished building a temple for the Lord. And as he assembled all the people together and was dedicating the temple, he prayed the prayer that we heard earlier. And in that prayer, he included the foreigners, those who are outside the community or tribe of Israel, those from a distant land. That same word, foreigner, was used to describe Ruth, the Moabite, that you may remember came to live with Naomi in Israel. It can also mean, in this case, in his prayer, those who have heard of the God of Israel. Solomon's prayer was that when the foreigner comes and prays toward this house, that God would hear their prayers and would do according to all the foreigner asks of God, so that all the people of the earth may know God's name. There was no doubt in this prayer that the temple Solomon had built would become a place known far and near as sacred ground, where sincere prayers of everyone would be welcome. So let's talk about foreigners this morning. Unfortunately, with the recent bombing at the Boston Marathon, that word's been floated around a lot. It didn't take long for the suspects, the Tsarnaev brothers, to go from being Caucasian to being Chechen, and it didn't take long for many in the news and elsewhere to differentiate them as different or other than us, even though one of them is an American citizen. But you know, there are other meanings too for foreigner in our culture in North America. Depending on where a person grew up, anyone outside our own region could be labeled a foreigner. I lived in Richmond, Virginia for 7 years, and I quickly realized that when Virginia natives call the Civil War still the War of Northern Aggression, there's still a clear distinction for them between the North and the South. If one is a Native American in this country, then everyone else who settled in our land could be thought of as foreign. For some of us who were raised in strictly delineated Christian denominations or faith traditions, those who do not practice our religious rituals in the same way we do are quite often labeled as foreign to the right faith. To name two examples of sacraments, metropolitan community churches are unique among Christianity for accommodating various forms of baptism and for welcoming everyone to the communion table. That does not happen in lots of places. Others whom we may consider as religiously foreign are those who do not hold the same belief system we do or have no belief in God at all. Now, for those of you who don't know us, my partner Marianne and I have a mixed relationship. We were both born in the South. We both have some Irish ancestry, so that's not it. While we differ on approaches to many things, one thing in particular stands out. For me, as an introvert, the behavior of extroverts can sometimes seem pretty foreign. And I'm sure Marianne wonders sometimes why I can't be more like her. Just to be a little more clear about that, I have for you here the symbol of an introvert recharging station. Notice the book. Notice the one person. Then we look at what extroverts go to be recharged. You know, for extroverts, it's the more the merrier. For introverts, it's the fewer the better. In our society, we also might speak of foreigners as those whose idea of beauty differs from ours, those whose skin color differs from ours, even if only slightly, those who speak a different primary language than we do, those whose mental state differs from our own, those whose food preferences and manner of eating are not the same, and on and on. In Luke's gospel reading today, the second reading we have another example of a foreigner in the story of the centurion. In this account, we have four main characters in addition to Jesus: the centurion, the Jewish elders, the friends of the centurion, and the centurion's slave. I use the term slave here because the translation as servant glosses over the situation. So let's look at the centurion a little more closely. And thank you to my technical assistant back there. The centurion is an outsider in a couple of ways. He's a Gentile, so he's a non-Jew, and he is also a Roman army commander of 100 soldiers. That's where we get centurion. That makes him an integral part of the empire that is actively oppressing the Jewish people at this time. We know that he could not have been a total convert to Judaism, even if he was a sympathizer, because Rome would not have allowed him to take the important final step in becoming a Jew, being circumcised. In spite of his foreign status, though, this centurion had earned the respect of the Jewish elders. They tell Jesus he is worthy of Jesus' help. As I said, he may have been a sympathizer with the Jewish people, enough that he would build them a synagogue, even if he did not worship there himself. He may have respected their God enough to encourage their gathering to worship. The slave was important enough to the centurion that he took a risk in seeking the help of the Jewish elders to contact Jesus because of Jesus' reputation for healing. The centurion looked upon the illness of his slave as a matter of authority, and that Jesus had an authority that could overrule the power behind the slave's terrible suffering. The centurion compared the word of Jesus to his own issuing of commands that would be carried out without question. So from the centurion standpoint, Jesus would have the last word in the situation, and his slave would be healed. Let's look a little bit more at the elders of the Jews. That word elders here likely refers to the local synagogue leaders. They were acquainted both with the centurion, because he built their synagogue, and with Jesus, if only by his reputation for healing. But later in the Gospels and in the book of Acts, that same word, elders, will be used to refer to the Jewish officials in Jerusalem who opposed both Jesus and his disciples and plotted to kill him. At this point, however, these leaders seek Jesus' help for the sake of the centurion, whom they declare to be worthy. Perhaps their motive was self-serving as well, since this was the man who built their synagogue. As any of us who've worked for a nonprofit know, it's a good idea to keep your donors happy. The elders would not have ever been inside the home of the centurion, since to associate this closely with a Gentile was against Jewish law. But still, they were part of the centurion's web of relationships, as New Testament professor Greg Carey of Lancaster Theological Seminary names it in an essay he wrote on this passage in Luke. So speaking of that web of relationships, the innermost circle are the friends of the centurion. In the story, we see that they are the people who know him best. They bring his message and his words to Jesus so they can quote what he had to say. And they stop Jesus and the elders on the road, on the way. They do whatever needs to be done for the centurion. Who might they have been? Well, probably more Gentiles, perhaps other Roman army officers, possibly even non-believers in Jesus' ministry, But they still wanted whatever help they could find for their friend. The centurion slave, like everyone else in the story other than Jesus, has no name, but he is very dear to the centurion, we know that. We also know that he's seriously ill. Luke's gospel describes him as close to death. In the Gospel of Matthew, there's another account very similar, and the slave is described there as suffering terribly and even paralyzed. So this is a very serious illness. We've already seen that the centurion is willing to go to great lengths to seek healing for his slave. And this is not just any slave to him. Surely he can afford to replace a slave. He has enough wealth to build a synagogue. Some commentators have observed that the word for he cared deeply could mean that the centurion valued or highly esteemed the slave, maybe for special training he had, or education he'd been given, or years of faithful service. But the problem with that reading is that this usage is normally reserved in the New Testament for someone of high rank. Obviously, this does not fit the situation of the slave. But still, the centurion intimos had deep regard, deep caring for his slave. Professor of theology Theodore Jennings points out that the other use of that word is in reference to someone who is especially close or intimate. Now, there are two words used in the story to refer to servants or slaves. The most common and more generic is doulos, which in the story in Luke is used 4 times. It's used by the Jewish elders, and it's used by the narrator Luke. The other word is pais, which is the word used by the centurion when speaking of his slave who is ill. Now, why does that matter? You didn't know you were going to get a Greek lesson this morning, did you? Well, the word pais can be translated in a few ways: young man, son, slave, or boy. According to Jennings, it was regularly used of the male beloved in a same-sex relationship. That term boy was often used to mean a younger friend or lover. It could also be used of an adult, similar to what we say when we say boyfriend, even though we're speaking of an adult. It may help us, in order to process this a little bit, it may help us to think of legal requirements in this country in different states that vary as to what is legal age for heterosexual marriage. It can vary between 15 to 18, sometimes younger, even though we would generally speak of 18 as adulthood. Now I'm going to draw from Jennings' study of the parallel account in the Gospel of Matthew to help us understand how and why the slave may have been in a sexual relationship and beloved by the centurion. And just another word about Professor Jennings. He began the Center for LGBTQ Studies at Chicago Theological Seminary. He's been a strong heterosexual ally, and he has written about reading scripture from a gay positive experience. So this is taken from, some of this is taken from one of his books. When we look at the account in the Gospel of Matthew, which is in Matthew 8, 5 through 13, there are some things that are the same, there are some things that are different. The Gospel of Matthew sometimes has a reputation for being pretty straight-laced because it quotes so much from the Old Testament, and this was fulfilled in Jesus, and that was fulfilled in Jesus, so it looks like everything's got to fall right in line. But it actually pushes the envelope in some ways when it comes to the religious thought of that time. Matthew's gospel includes 4 specific cases of outsiders. You might remember that the genealogy of Jesus, so-and-so begat so-and-so, who begat so-and-so, and so on, that it includes 4 sexually suspect women. Their names are Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Although it's recorded that Rahab and Ruth were non-Israelites, it's also quite possible that all 4 of them were foreigners. And this is a, what do you call it, a selfless promotion, a shameless self-promotion, there we go. We did a class recently on these 4 women, and we hope to offer it in the future again as a workshop, among other things. So back to the outsiders. The Magi, or the wise men that most of us know about from the Christmas story, they were also considered to be sorcerers or magicians from the East. In fact, people in Israel were forbidden to have any contact with them. Some of the rabbis taught that anyone who did so would be deserving of death. So it was pretty daring for Matthew to include the Magi at the very beginning of the story of Jesus' birth. This is pretty outrageous. There's another woman in Matthew's gospel. She was called the Syrophoenician woman, meaning where she was from. She came to Jesus to ask for healing for her daughter. She was a Canaanite, so therefore she was considered to be among those who worshiped idols, who were practitioners of sexual deviance, and provided as a source male and female cultic prostitutes at places of religious ritual. Not the best company to be associated with. The centurion, of course, as we've looked at today, is the other one, and we've seen that he appears to have a same-gender relationship with his pais. The next slide gives us an example of what Hellenized or Greek-influenced Jewish propaganda of the day would have had to say about Gentiles. Who knew there was propaganda back in biblical times? So it would refer to Gentiles as sorcerers, idolaters, and engaging in same-gender sexual relationships. Oh my. Matthew's gospel, though, has made room for both the Gentiles and the sexually stigmatized, all of whom interact with Jesus. Jesus is never recorded as condemning any of them during their encounters with him. He heals both the Canaanite woman's daughter and the centurion's slave. Now, in the Gospel of Matthew, It's more directly implied then by this greater context that there is a sexual relationship between the centurion and the slave. You see, readers of that gospel in that time would have caught the distinction between doulos and pais. Doulos referring to the other slaves, and pais to my beloved or my boyfriend. They would have known when they heard both those terms together in that story that this is a symbol or a sign of sexual intimacy. Professor Carey also points this out. Now, when we go back to Luke's gospel, he downplays the nature of the relationship, and notice he plays up the connection with the Jewish elders and the building of the synagogue. For his audience, he may have been presenting the centurion as more religiously acceptable to his readers and hearers. But still, that Gospel of Luke has not wiped out that sexual connection altogether. See if you can hear it as I read it using the two Greek words. There, a centurion's doulos, whom his master valued highly, was sick and about to die. The centurion heard of Jesus and sent some elders of the Jews to him, asking him to come and heal his doulos. When they came to Jesus, they pleaded earnestly with him, "This man deserves to have you do this, because he loves our nation and he has built our synagogue." So Jesus went with them. He was not far from the house when the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, for I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. That is why I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my pais will be healed. For I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes, and that one, come, and he comes. I say to my doulos, do this, and he does it." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the doulos in good health. Now, if you didn't quite catch that, whenever other people are referring to the slave or to the slaves of the household, it's doulos. But when the words of the centurion are sent to Jesus and brought there by his friends, it's about his pais, his beloved. So you might say the Gospel of Luke's attempt to clean up the story did not entirely succeed. Now, another interesting part is that in both Luke and Matthew, the centurion is not comfortable with having Jesus come to his home. In both cases, he stops Jesus from doing that. In Matthew's account, we see the centurion coming directly to Jesus with no one intervening for him. But he still says, "I am not worthy to have you come under my roof." And as you recall, in Luke's gospel, it's the friends who bring that message, but they use those same words. "I am not worthy to have you come under my roof." The centurion likely knew that religious Jews of the day would revile his relationship. And as Jennings says, they would have no understanding of it and no sympathy for the love he knows. Having them enter his home was too great a risk of rejection and ridicule. This story has staying power, though. Earlier, I mentioned Professor Carey's essay on this passage in Luke. It's in the most recent issue of Interpretation, a journal of Bible and theology. Full disclosure, where I work. And in it, I'm proud to quote from him, "I have no desire to stir up the sexuality debates among the churches, but I must also confess my own bafflement with so many commentators who simply assume that this relationship is asexual." Former Jesuit priest and professor, and now current MCC pastor Bob Goss, points out something quite ironic. Catholics are taught to remember this man in a homoerotic relationship as they recite these words at the reception of communion. "Lord, I am unworthy that you come under my roof, but just say the word, and my soul shall be healed." Can we relate in some ways to the story of the centurion? Have there not been times that we may have felt not worthy to ask Jesus to come into our own situation? Along with the centurion, we need that web of relationships. Sometimes we need to ask people to pray to Jesus for us, for healing, for those who are dear to us, as the centurion did when he sent the Jewish elders. Sometimes we need friends who will intervene on our behalf. Friends who know that we are not yet ready to be completely vulnerable. Jennings also reminds us that just as Jesus reached out to the sexually marginalized, including eunuchs, prostitutes, and now the centurion we've seen, neither is it our place to stigmatize or re-marginalize that which we don't understand or cannot relate to. This is Pride Month, but sometimes within our diverse LGBTQ population, we create divisions. Perhaps out of lack of understanding, or perhaps from a desire to be assimilated into the mainstream of the culture. We may show contempt or distance ourselves, for example, from those who have polyamorous relationships, those who participate in leather play, or who practice other forms of sexual role-playing. In effect, then, we make them, those of our own, into foreigners, keeping them in the closet in order to avoid any association with them. There was a young man that I met when I took some courses that shared with the group that he was embarrassed to have his MCC minister come to his home while he was recovering from surgery. Some of us sat puzzled in the room wondering, aren't MCC ministers the most open of everybody? At least we like to think so. Then he shared with us that he and his partner do role-playing, and they have equipment in their house. And he didn't know how the minister would act or react when he came in. As it turned out, the minister was in the room with us, who then identified himself, and it then became clear he didn't react in a poor way. He came to minister to the need, and that was what was more important. The divisions between us can be for other reasons too. Each group that is a component of that acronym LGBTQ is sometimes guilty of drawing lines between themselves and the rest. For lesbians, we may have those who are able to pass because we look more feminine, some of us, and we may be uncomfortable with those who identify as more masculine, and that old femme-butch divide, and vice versa. There may be discomfort on both sides. For gay males, those who identify as more feminine or queens are often ostracized by those who appear as more masculine. I have a friend in Virginia that time after time, very masculine gay men would come up to him and tell him they wanted to date him. And then here was the catch. So long as they could keep it quiet and nobody knew that they were dating. For bisexuals, they're often told that they should decide whether they're gay or heterosexual. We may not want to stretch ourselves enough to accept that a person can have an attraction that may be fluid, regardless of whether this fits our own experience. For transgender folks, the T in LGBT is often treated as though it's not existent. Or there's an attitude that the gay struggle is not the same as their struggle. Same gender-loving and bisexual folk may fail to differentiate between gender identity, which we all possess on a spectrum, sexual and affectional attraction to either or both genders, which is unique to the person, and gender presentation, again, which we all display in one form or another. The desired rights of trans persons are not so different. And finally, the word queer, the Q in LGBTQ. For some of us, you kind of shudder, maybe a little, we might, because that term is still uncomfortable. It's been used in harmful ways. For others, it's just not specific enough. It's not L or G or B or T. It's Q. It's queer. But for some, that word empowers them by allowing for a wider spectrum of identification that are not easily pinned down, and that is the beauty of it. So in this month of Pride, we must remember that just as the rainbow symbolizes many colors in one flag, LGBTQ represents a diversity of people who need not be divided from one another. We have the opportunity to develop and strengthen webs of relationships among ourselves. So in closing, let's go back to Solomon's prayer, where he asked that the foreigners be welcome to pray in this house. We are also challenged to make sure that our house, our LGBTQ household, and the household we share with all of creation is a welcoming place. Solomon expected that foreigners would hear of the God of Israel's great name, God's mighty hand, and God's outstretched arm of love and compassion. As a result, they would want to come and pray, and their prayers would be heard. Whose prayers are welcome in our midst? What have people heard about our God that would draw them here to a place of prayer where they will be heard?